July 24th, 1943, 14,000 feet above the Sicilian coast, aboard a B-17 named Devil's Advocate. Technical Sergeant Raymond Kowalski stands at the right waist gun position, hands wrapped around the spade grips of his Browning M250 caliber machine gun, watching a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka roll into its attack dive roughly 3,000 feet above the formation. The German dive bomber tips past vertical, its distinctive gull wings catching the Mediterranean sun, that horrifying siren beginning its banshee wail as the pilot commits to his run. Kowalski does exactly what 18 months of training has taught him. He elevates his gun barrel, tracking the descending aircraft, trying to keep his iron sights centered on the Stuka's engine cowling as it plummets toward the bomber formation below. His gun mount allows maybe 60 degrees of upward elevation, decent for level attacks, completely inadequate for what's happening now. The Stuka is diving at nearly 90 degrees, accelerating through 300 miles per hour, and Kowalski's gun barrel hits its mechanical stop. He can't elevate any higher. The mount simply won't go further. He's watching the attacker through his sight picture for perhaps 2 seconds before the aircraft drops below his angle of fire. The Stuka disappears beneath the B-17's fuselage, and Kowalski is left pointing his guns at empty sky, 600 rounds of ammunition useless, while somewhere below his aircraft, that German pilot is lining up his bomb release on another fortress in the formation. He hears the dull crump of explosions, feels the shockwave even at this altitude, and watches a B-17 from the low squadron stagger out of formation, its number 3 engine streaming black smoke. The Stuka pulls out of its dive, untouched, and climbs away to set up another run. Kowalski has just experienced what thousands of American gunners were discovering in the summer of 1943. Their defensive armament, magnificent against level attacks and tail chases, was geometrically helpless against the Luftwaffe's dive-bombing tactics. The math was brutally simple. A Stuka beginning its attack run at 12,000 feet would roll inverted, pull through to a near-vertical dive angle between 80 and 90 degrees, and accelerate toward its target. From the moment it committed to the dive until bomb release at roughly 3,000 feet, the aircraft was technically within range of bomber defensive fire for perhaps 15 to 20 seconds. But for the vast majority of that time, it was diving at angles that conventional waistgun mounts simply couldn't track. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Standard Browning M. 2 installations on B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds in 1943 were designed for threats approaching on roughly level trajectories. The waist guns, mounted on simple pivot posts, could traverse 360 degrees horizontally and elevate upward about 60 degrees from horizontal. This made perfect sense for engaging German fighters making beam attacks, head-on passes, or tail chases. But against an aircraft diving at 85 degrees, that 60-degree elevation meant your effective engagement window lasted perhaps 3 seconds before the attacker simply dove below your gun's depression limit. The problem compounded when you factored in the ballistics of the engagement. A 50 caliber round traveled at approximately 2,800 feet per second. Against a target diving vertically at 350 miles per hour, that's roughly 513 feet per second, closing speed became astronomical. At a range of 600 yards, your bullets needed just under 2/3 of a second to reach the target's position. In that 2/3 of a second, a diving Stuka covered another 340 feet downward. You weren't just dealing with deflection shooting, aiming ahead of a crossing target. You were dealing with 3-dimensional deflection against a target moving through a vertical plane that your weapon mount wasn't geometrically capable of tracking. The 8th Air Force Gunnery Analysis Section compiled statistics from combat missions over Germany in May and June of 1943, and the numbers revealed a catastrophic vulnerability. Bomber gunners achieved hit rates of approximately 4 to 6% against German fighters, making conventional attacks from level or slightly elevated positions. Against dive bombers, that hit rate collapsed to less than 1%, effectively zero, The human cost accumulated quickly. During the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing an average of 90 heavy bombers per month, each carrying 10 men. While German fighters accounted for the majority of losses, Luftwaffe dive bombers, particularly Ju-87 seconds and Ju-88 seconds, operating in the Mediterranean, and later FW-190 seconds, configured for dive bombing over Germany, were claiming bombers at rates that exceeded their numbers. A single Stuka that could dive through a formation unmolested, its pilot calmly selecting targets while American gunners fired uselessly at angles their mounts couldn't sustain, could cripple or destroy multiple bombers in a single pass. Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan, a ball turret gunner with the 306th Bomb Group, kept detailed notes of his missions. His entry for August 3rd, 1943, over Kassel captures the helpless fury. Watched 2 Stukas work over the low squadron. Could see them the whole way down. My turret tracked them for maybe 4 seconds before they dove past my angle. Fired maybe 30 rounds total. Don't think I hit anything. Felt like watching someone murder your friends while you hold an empty gun. The ball turret. Theoretically, the most flexible defensive position on a B-17, with its ability to rotate a full 360 degrees and elevate nearly 90 degrees straight up, still faced the same limitation. Once an attacker dove past a certain angle, even the ball turret's impressive range of motion couldn't maintain track through the critical bomb release phase. And the waist, gunners, whose positions offered the best fields of fire for beam attacks, were almost completely useless against vertical divers. Combat crews began reporting this vulnerability through channels in mid-1943. Squadron gunnery officers compiled incident reports. Group commanders forwarded recommendations to division level. The 8th Air Force Gunnery Research Section at Bovingdon, England, received mounting evidence that bomber defensive doctrine had a massive blind spot, literally. The British had identified a similar problem earlier. Royal Air Force Bomber Command, flying night missions over Germany with Lancaster and Halifax heavy bombers, faced their own dive-bombing threats from German night fighters that would position above the bomber stream and dive through formations. RAF gunners in Fraser-Nash turrets, while more sophisticated than early American installations, still struggled to track near-vertical attacks. British ordnance teams experimented with modified turret stops and enhanced elevation angles, but the fundamental problem remained. Guns mounted in conventional orientation, designed to fire outward from the aircraft at roughly level targets, were geometrically wrong for engaging threats diving from directly above. The solution, when it emerged, didn't come from engineering laboratories or official modification programs. It came from crew chiefs and armourers at forward airfields in North Africa and Sicily, men who'd watched too many bombers stagger home with bomb damage that should never have occurred, who'd listened to gunners describing the geometric nightmare of trying to shoot at aircraft they could see but couldn't aim at. The first documented inverted 50 caliber installation appeared on a B-24 Liberator of the 98th Bomb Group operating out of Benghazi, Libya, in late June 1943. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Thomas Delaney, had listened to his waist gunners complain about dive bombers for weeks. During a maintenance stand-down, Delaney and his armourer, Sergeant First Class Joseph Ridgway, decided to experiment. The concept was almost absurdly simple. Instead of mounting the Browning M2 in its standard orientation, with the barrel pointing outward and slightly upward from the aircraft's waist window, they inverted the entire gun, literally flipped it upside down on its mount. This required fabricating new mounting brackets and significantly modifying the ammunition feed system, because a Browning M2 expects gravity to help feed rounds from the ammunition box into the receiver. Flip the gun over, and suddenly you're fighting gravity with every round. Ridgway solved the feed problem by rigging a spring-loaded assist mechanism, essentially a series of tension springs that helped force the ammunition belt upward into the inverted receiver. It was crude, prone to jamming, and absolutely not authorized by any technical manual. It also worked. The inverted mounting changed the gun's geometry entirely. where a standard installation might achieve 60 degrees of upward elevation before hitting mechanical stops, the inverted gun could now depress downward from the horizontal by 70 degrees or more. From the gunner's perspective, this created a coverage zone that extended almost straight down from the aircraft's belly. A Stuka, diving vertically past the bomber, was now within the gun's tracking arc for the entire dive profile, from initial commitment at 12,000 feet down to bomb release at 3,000. There was a catch, of course. The gunner now had to operate the weapon completely inverted from normal doctrine. The spade grips were upside down. The trigger, normally squeezed by your thumbs, was now under your palms. Sighting through iron sights meant craning your neck at awkward angles. And the physical act of tracking a target downward, following a diving aircraft while operating an inverted weapon system, demanded a completely different muscle memory than anything training had taught. The first combat test, that happened on July 2nd, 1943, during a raid on Messina Harbour. Staff Sergeant Leonard Vickers, the right waist gunner on Delaney's bomber, faced a Ju-87 diving through the formation. The German bomber rolled in from 14,000 feet, 2,000 feet above the American formation, committed to its dive at an 85-degree angle, and dove straight into Vickers's new field of fire. Vickers later described the engagement in a debriefing that was recorded and transcribed by the group intelligence officer. It felt completely backward. I'm used to tracking targets by raising the gun, following them up and across. This time, I was pushing the gun down, chasing this bastard through his dive. The weapon's upside down, my hands are reversed on the grips, and I'm trying to remember which way to lead him because everything's inverted. He fired a burst at roughly 5,000 feet of slant range, 70 rounds, tracers arcing downward toward the diving Ju-87. The first rounds missed, passing behind the aircraft's tail. Vickers adjusted, leading further, and his second burst walked up the fuselage from tail to cockpit. Gun camera footage, analysed later, showed at least 15 impacts. The Ju-88's dive angle steepened uncontrollably, the pilot either dead or unable to pull out, and the aircraft augured into the Mediterranean at terminal velocity. One engagement, one kill. Against a target profile that conventional gunnery doctrine said was effectively untouchable. Word spread through the 98th Bomb Group within days. Other crew chiefs examined Delaney's work, measured the mounting brackets, studied the ammunition feed modifications. Within 2 weeks, 5 more B-24 seconds in the group had inverted waist gun installations. Within a month, the modification had spread to neighbouring groups in North Africa. The official response was predictably bureaucratic. The 8th Air Force Technical Services Command, receiving reports of unauthorised weapons modifications, initially issued directives ordering the removal of inverted installations. The weapons, they argued, hadn't been tested, weren't covered by technical manuals, created ammunition feed reliability issues, and violated standardized gunnery doctrine. Combat crews ignored the directives. Squadron commanders, watching kill claims rise and bomber losses from dive-bombing attacks decline, quietly allowed the modifications to continue. By August 1943, an estimated 40 to 50 heavy bombers operating in the Mediterranean theatre had some form of inverted 50 caliber installation. The statistics, when they were finally compiled and analysed properly, told a story that overcome bureaucratic resistance. Bombers equipped with inverted waist guns were achieving hit rates against dive bombers of approximately 12 to 15%, compared to less than 1% for conventional installations. The mathematics were stark. A waist gunner with an inverted mount, firing at a Stuka diving through his formation, now had a realistic chance of damaging or destroying the attacker before bomb release. A conventional mount made him a spectator to his own potential death. The feed reliability problems proved solvable. Armourer teams experimented with different spring tensions, modified ammunition box positions, and developed feed chutes that guided the belt more reliably into the inverted receiver. Jamming rates, initially high at nearly 15%, dropped to acceptable levels below 5%, comparable to standard installations under combat conditions. The sighting problem required adaptation rather than hardware. Gunners training on inverted mounts learned to use Kentucky windage, point shooting rather than precise sight alignment, because the awkward body positions required to aim an upside-down gun made traditional marksmanship techniques impractical. Experienced gunners developed an almost intuitive sense of where their tracers were going, adjusting fire by watching bullet strikes rather than relying on sight pictures. Staff: Sergeant Raymond Kowalski, the waist gunner from Devil's Advocate who'd helplessly watched Stukas dive past his conventional mount in July, flew his first mission with an inverted installation on August 18, 1943, during a raid on Foggia, Italy. His aircraft, along with most of the 463rd Bomb Group, had been modified during a maintenance cycle at their Tunisian airfield. Kowalski's diary entry for that mission marks the transformation. New gun mount is strange as hell. Took me 3 tries on the ground just to figure out how to hold the grips properly. But when that first Stuka rolled in, and I could actually track him all the way through his dive, and I watched my tracers walk right into his engine cowling, and he started trailing smoke, it felt like someone finally gave me a real weapon instead of a toy. The modification spread beyond the Mediterranean. As bomber groups rotated back to England, crew chiefs shared technical details. The 8th Air Force, operating over Germany, faced different threats, primarily conventional fighter attacks rather than dive bombers. But the geometric advantage of inverted mounts proved valuable even against fighters making high-side attacks, diving passes that brought them through vertical planes where conventional guns struggled to track. By October 1943, enough field data had accumulated that the Army Air Force's Materiel Command at Wright Field, Ohio, launched a formal evaluation program. Engineers tested inverted mounting systems, analyzed feed mechanisms, compiled combat effectiveness reports. The conclusion, reached in December 1943, acknowledged what combat crews had known for months. Inverted installations provided critical coverage against high-angle attacks with acceptable reliability penalties. The official modification kit, designated the E11 Inverted Mount Assembly, entered production in January 1944. It included purpose-designed mounting brackets, a spring-assisted ammunition feed system, and modified spade, grips that were more ergonomic when operated upside down. The installation manual specified that 1 waist gun per bomber should be configured in inverted orientation, maintaining 1 conventional mount for standard beam attacks. But by the time official kits began reaching operational units, field modifications had already proliferated. Estimates suggest that by spring 1944, more than 400 heavy bombers in Europe and the Mediterranean had some form of inverted 50 caliber installation, most of them crew chief specials, built from scavenged parts and improvised brackets. The doctrinal shift took longer than the hardware modification. Gunnery schools in the United States, training new aerial gunners, continued teaching conventional mounting doctrine through most of 1943. Students graduated, shipped to combat units, and discovered their training was incomplete. Forward gunnery officers began running abbreviated courses teaching inverted weapon operation, essentially field expedient, training that filled the gap between institutional doctrine and combat reality. Lieutenant Colonel James Richardson, Chief Gunnery Officer for the 5th Bombardment Wing, recognized the training deficit and commissioned the production of a field manual specifically covering inverted mount operations. Published in March 1944 and distributed to bomb groups, the manual was refreshingly direct about the modification's origins. The inverted 50 caliber mount was not developed in laboratories or testing facilities. It was created by enlisted maintenance personnel, responding to a specific tactical vulnerability. This manual represents the formalization of field-developed techniques that have already proven combat effective. The manual detailed proper mounting procedures, ammunition feed configurations, and critically, gunnery techniques for engaging high-angle targets with inverted weapons. It emphasized that gunners needed to suppress their trained instincts about weapon orientation and trust their tracer observation, watching where rounds were actually going rather than relying on conventional sight pictures. One section addressed the psychological challenge directly. Operating an inverted weapon system requires accepting that everything you learned about weapon handling is reversed. The gun is upside down. Your grip is backwards. Your sight picture is inverted. Trust your tracers. Adjust your fire based on what you see impacting, not what doctrine taught you to expect. Training cadence shifted. By mid-1944, stateside gunnery schools incorporated inverted mount familiarization into their curricula. Students spent time on both conventional and inverted systems, learning that modern aerial gunnery demanded flexibility. Some gunners proved naturally adept at inverted operation. Others struggled with the reversed controls and awkward body mechanics. Gunnery instructors learned to identify which students had the spatial reasoning to master inverted techniques and recommend assignments accordingly. The Luftwaffe noticed. German tactical intelligence reports from late 1943 and early 1944, captured after the war, document growing German awareness that American bomber defensive fire had become more effective against diving attacks. A report from Luftflotte 2, operating in Italy, dated November 1943, noted, American heavy bombers have modified defensive armament to improve coverage against high-angle attacks. Dive bombing approaches that were previously safe now encounter effective defensive fire throughout the attack profile. German pilots adapted their tactics, but their options were limited. The Ju-87 Stuka, already obsolescent by 1943, became effectively suicidal over areas where American bombers operated with inverted gun installations. Stuka units were pulled from Western European operations and reassigned to the Eastern Front, where Soviet air defenses were less technologically sophisticated. More capable aircraft, like the Fu-190, when configured for dive bombing roles, still faced the same geometric problem. A diving attack brought them through vertical planes, where inverted American .50 calibers could now track and engage effectively. German pilots began favoring shallower attack angles, 45 to 60 degrees instead of near-vertical dives, trading bombing accuracy for reduced exposure to defensive fire. The modification's success created unexpected challenges. Ammunition logistics became more complex because inverted guns experienced different wear patterns and required specialized maintenance procedures. Spare parts inventories had to account for inverted specific components. Training pipelines struggled to balance conventional and inverted instruction without extending course lengths. But these were solvable problems, the kind of challenges that emerge when a successful innovation spreads faster than institutional adaptation. The alternative, continuing to operate bombers with massive defensive blind spots, was unacceptable. By spring 1944, the inverted .50 caliber mount had evolved from unauthorized field modification to standard equipment. The E-11 mount kit was being installed on new production bombers at factories in the United States. B-17Gs, rolling off Boeing's Seattle production line, came equipped with inverted mounts as original equipment. The modification that started with a crew chief in North Africa, frustrated by watching his gunners helplessly track untouchable targets, had become institutionalized doctrine. Staff Sergeant Thomas Vickers, the gunner who'd scored the first confirmed kill with an inverted mount back in July 1943, completed his tour in February 1944 with 6 confirmed kills and 11 probables. 4 of those confirmed kills were dive bombers engaged during their attack runs, targets that would have been untouchable with conventional mounts. In his final debriefing before rotation home, Vickers told the intelligence officer, "The inverted gun shouldn't work. Everything about it feels wrong. Your hands are backward, you're pushing down when training taught you to pull up, and you're aiming at targets through geometry that makes no sense. But it works because the targets are flying through space that conventional guns can't cover. Sometimes the solution to a problem isn't elegant. It's just backwards." The geometric revolution represented by inverted mounting extended beyond simple hardware modification. It forced a fundamental reconceptualization of defensive doctrine that had remained essentially unchanged since the First World War. The assumption underlying all previous bomber defensive design was that threats approached on roughly horizontal planes. Fighters attacked from the sides, from above at shallow angles, from behind, or head-on. All of these attack vectors operated within a geometric envelope that conventional gun mounts could address. Dive bombing, particularly the near-vertical profiles that Luftwaffe pilots had perfected in Spain during the Civil War and refined through Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, represented an entirely different threat geometry. The attacking aircraft wasn't crossing through the defender's horizontal plane. It was dropping through vertical space, spending the vast majority of its attack run in a geometric cone that conventional defensive armament couldn't cover. The technical challenge this presented went beyond simply mounting guns upside down. The real problem was that American bomber defensive doctrine in 1942 and early 1943 had been optimized for a threat environment that no longer existed. The Luftwaffe had evolved. American defenses hadn't kept pace. Consider the B-17's defensive armament as designed. In its early configurations, the Flying Fortress carried up to 11 50 caliber machine guns, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that theoretically covered every approach vector. Twin guns in the tail turret covered the rear. 2 guns in the dorsal turret protected the top. The ball turret underneath provided lower hemisphere coverage. Waist guns on both sides handled beam attacks. Cheek guns in the nose dealt with head-on passes. This armament layout made perfect sense against German fighters making conventional attacks. A Focke-Wulf, 190 approaching from 3 o'clock at level altitude, would encounter fire from the right waist gun, the ball turret, and possibly the tail turret if its attack angle brought it through their fire cones. The overlapping coverage meant attackers faced continuous fire throughout their approach. But a Ju-87 rolling into a dive from 15,000 feet, pulling through to an 85-degree dive angle and accelerating toward bomb release at 3,000 feet, spent perhaps 18 seconds in its attack run. For roughly 15 of those seconds, it was diving at angles steeper than 70 degrees from horizontal. The ball turret could track it for maybe 4 seconds before the Stuka dove below the turret's depression limits. The dorsal turret couldn't depress steeply enough to engage. The tail turret was pointed the wrong direction, and the waist guns, mounted conventionally, could elevate to about 60 degrees, giving them perhaps 3 seconds of viable engagement time, 3 seconds out of an 18-second attack run. The Stuka pilot had 15 seconds to calmly line up his bomb run, make fine adjustments to his aim point, and release his ordnance, all while American gunners watched helplessly, fingers on triggers of weapons that couldn't aim at the threat killing them. Master Sergeant Robert Chen, an armourer with the 97th Bomb Group, described the vulnerability in a letter home dated August 1943. "It's like watching a hawk dive on a rabbit. The rabbit can see the hawk coming the whole way down, but rabbits don't have guns pointing up. Neither did we, until some smart crew chiefs figured out how to flip the guns over. Now the rabbits have teeth." The inverted mount didn't just provide coverage of a previously undefended geometric zone. It fundamentally altered the tactical calculus for German pilots considering dive-bombing attacks. Before inverted mounts became widespread, a competent Stuka or Ju-87 pilot could execute a near-vertical dive with reasonable confidence that American defensive fire would be ineffective. The primary threats were anti-aircraft artillery from the ground, Allied fighter escorts if they were present, and the inherent danger of pulling out from a high-speed dive. After inverted mounts proliferated, that same pilot now faced continuous defensive fire throughout his entire attack run. The moral effect was significant. Luftwaffe pilots, interviewed by Allied intelligence officers after being captured, repeatedly mentioned that American bomber defensive fire had become substantially more dangerous during late 1943 and early 1944. Several specifically noted that diving attacks, previously considered relatively safe, now resulted in unacceptable casualties. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The ammunition feed problem that plagued early inverted installations deserves deeper examination because its solution reveals the kind of practical engineering that characterized much of World War II American military adaptation. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun was designed in 1918 and refined through the 1,920 seconds and 30 seconds. Its feed mechanism, like virtually all machine guns of the era, relied partially on gravity to assist in pulling the ammunition belt from the storage box into the weapon's receiver. Flip the gun upside down, and suddenly gravity becomes your enemy. The ammunition belt, instead of dropping down into the receiver, has to be pulled upward against its own weight. The feed springs in a standard Browning M2 weren't designed for this. Early inverted installations experienced jam rates exceeding 20%, meaning 1 in round in 5 failed to feed properly. In combat, where a typical engagement might involve firing 50 to 100 rounds, a 20% jam rate was catastrophic. Sergeant First Class Joseph Ridgway, the armourer who'd helped Thomas Delaney create the first inverted mount, spent weeks troubleshooting the feed problem. His solution involved 3 modifications. First, he increased the tension on the feed springs by roughly 30%, giving them enough force to overcome gravity when pulling the belt upward. Second, he fabricated guide chutes from sheet aluminum that channeled the ammunition belt more directly into the receiver, reducing the angle the belt had to traverse. Third, and most cleverly, he positioned the ammunition box directly above the inverted gun, so that gravity actually assisted the initial feed from box to chute, even if it worked against the final feed from chute to receiver. These modifications were documented with hand-drawn diagrams and distributed through informal channels, crew chief to crew chief, armourer to armourer. By the time the Army Air Forces officially studied the problem in late 1943, Ridgway's solutions had already been independently rediscovered and implemented by maintenance personnel at dozens of airfields across North Africa, Sicily, and England. The official E-11 mount kit incorporated Ridgway's modifications almost exactly, with minor refinements for mass production. In one of the war's small ironies, Ridgway received no official recognition for his innovation. His contribution was buried in technical reports credited to right field engineering teams who'd formalized what he'd already invented. The sighting challenge proved more resistant to hardware solutions. Traditional marksmanship doctrine emphasized proper sight alignment. Align the front sight with the rear sight, place both on the target, control your breathing, squeeze the trigger smoothly. This worked perfectly for rifles, pistols, and even machine guns in conventional mounts where the weapon's orientation matched the shooter's natural body position. Inverted guns made traditional sighting nearly impossible. To properly align sights on an upside-down weapon, the gunner had to crane his neck at angles that were sustainable for maybe 10 seconds before muscle fatigue made precision aiming impossible. Some gunners tried various workarounds: mirrors that reflected the sight picture, homemade periscope arrangements, even attempting to shoot with their heads tilted 90 degrees. Nothing worked reliably under combat conditions. The solution, arrived at independently by multiple gunners, was to abandon traditional sighting entirely and rely on tracer observation. Every 5th round in a 50 caliber ammunition belt was a tracer, a bullet with a pyrotechnic compound in its base that burned brightly, making the round's trajectory visible to the naked eye. Gunners learned to fire short bursts, watch where their tracers went, and adjust their aim, based on what they saw, not what their sights told them. This technique, called walking fire or Kentucky windage, depending on who you asked, was considered almost heretical by peacetime marksmanship instructors. It was imprecise, wasted ammunition on spotting rounds, and relied on the shooter's ability to process visual information and make corrections in real time. But under combat conditions, against high-speed targets at ranges where a few feet of error didn't matter, tracer observation shooting proved remarkably effective. Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb, a left-waist gunner with the 449th Bomb Group, became known throughout his squadron for his proficiency with the inverted mount. He was credited with 4 confirmed kills and 7 probables, 3 of those kills being dive bombers engaged during their attack runs. When asked by his squadron gunnery officer to explain his technique, Webb's description was refreshingly direct. "You don't aim an inverted gun, you point it. Approximately where the target will be, fire a burst, watch your tracers, and adjust. If your tracers pass behind his tail, you lead more. If they pass ahead of his nose, you lead less. It's like shooting skeet, except the clay pigeons are shooting back and flying at 400 miles per hour." The psychological adjustment required to master inverted gunnery went beyond simply learning reversed controls. It demanded suppressing deeply ingrained instincts about weapon handling that every gunner had internalized during training. When you see a threat, human instinct says, point your weapon at the threat. But with inverted mounts against diving targets, effective gunnery meant pointing your weapon at empty sky well ahead of where the target currently was, then tracking downward, firing at space the target hadn't reached yet. This created a cognitive dissonance similar to what bomber pilots experienced when learning deflection shooting against crossing targets. Your conscious mind understood the physics. Your bullets needed time to travel. The target was moving. Therefore, you had to aim ahead. But your unconscious mind, shaped by millennia of evolution, where thrown rocks and spears followed straight lines to visible targets, screamed that you were aiming at nothing. Gunnery training cadre at schools in the United States struggled to teach this counterintuitive technique. Instructors used blackboards to diagram bullet flight time versus target motion. They showed gun camera footage of successful engagements where tracers arced toward empty sky and targets flew into the stream. They ran drill after drill where students practiced tracking targets without firing, just following the motion, suppressing the urge to center the sight on the visible aircraft. Some students adapted quickly. They possessed what instructors called natural deflection sense, an intuitive understanding of relative motion that translated into effective shooting with minimal formal instruction. Others struggled for weeks, their training scores remaining marginal even after hundreds of practice rounds. The difference appeared to be partially neurological. Some brains more easily processed the 3-dimensional geometry of intercepting moving targets. By mid-1944, gunnery schools had enough data to identify predictive factors. Students with experience hunting birds, particularly waterfowl or clay pigeons, tended to adapt faster to deflection shooting. The hand-eye coordination developed leading flying targets with a shotgun transferred directly to aerial gunnery. Recruiters began specifically seeking out skeet shooters and bird hunters for aerial gunnery training, recognizing that months of shotgun experience provided better preparation than anything the Army could teach in 6 weeks. The inverted mounts spread through combat units created logistical complications that revealed gaps in the Army Air Force's supply chain management. Conventional gun mounts used standardized parts, mounting brackets, ammunition chutes, charging handles. Depots stocked these components in quantity. Inverted mounts, even after the E-11 kit was standardized, required different brackets, modified chutes, and specialized feed mechanisms. Supply sergeants at forward airfields discovered their parts inventories couldn't support mixed conventional and inverted installations. A bomber group operating 30 aircraft, each with one inverted mount, needed separate part stocks for 2 different mounting systems. When inverted mounts broke during combat, and they broke frequently due to the mechanical stress of high-G maneuvering and combat damage, maintenance crews often had to cannibalize parts from damaged aircraft or jury-rig repairs using whatever materials were available. Master Sergeant Donald Pierce, the maintenance chief for the 454th Bomb Squadron, kept detailed logs of parts failures and repair procedures. His records from November 1943 through March 1944 document 47. Separate failures of inverted mount components across his squadron's 10 aircraft. Feed spring failures accounted for 18 incidents. Mounting bracket cracks from repeated firing stress caused 12 failures. Ammunition chute deformation from combat damage created 9 problems. The remaining 8 were miscellaneous: charging handle breakages, trigger mechanism failures, and one bizarre incident where a belt of ammunition froze solid in the chute during a mission at 28,000 feet and had to be chipped out with screwdrivers. Pierce's solution was to maintain a war stock of cannibalized parts, essentially stripping components from write-off aircraft and stockpiling them for emergency repairs. This was completely outside official supply procedures, but it kept his squadron's inverted mounts operational when depot supply chains couldn't deliver replacement parts fast enough. The reliability problems gradually improved as engineering teams analyzed field failure reports and refined the E-11 kit design. By summer 1944, second-generation inverted mounts incorporated heavier-duty mounting brackets, improved feed springs with better metallurgy, and ammunition chutes made from thicker-gauge aluminum. Failure rates dropped from the initial 15% to below 5%, making inverted mounts nearly as reliable as conventional installations. German tactical adaptation to inverted gun installations accelerated through late 1943 and into 1944. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine, distributed to fighter and bomber units, explicitly warned pilots that American heavy bombers now had improved defensive coverage against high-angle attacks. Captured documents included specific recommendations: avoid near-vertical diving attacks, favor attack angles below 60 degrees, maintain maximum speed during attack runs to minimize exposure to defensive fire. These tactical adjustments came at a cost to German bombing accuracy. The physics of dive bombing favored steep attack angles. A Ju-87 diving, at 85 degrees, could place bombs with remarkable precision, frequently hitting within 50 feet of the aim point. That same aircraft, attacking at 55 degrees, sacrificed accuracy for survivability. Bombing errors increased, mission effectiveness decreased, but German crews stayed alive longer. The broader strategic effect was difficult to quantify but significant. American bomber formations operating over Germany and occupied Europe suffered fewer losses from dive bombing attacks after inverted mounts became widespread. This didn't dramatically change overall loss rates because German fighters remained the primary threat, but it eliminated one specific vulnerability that had been claiming bombers at unacceptable rates during certain mission profiles. Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski, the waist gunner from Devil's Advocate, who'd been helpless against diving Stukas in July 1943, flew his 25th and final mission on March 12, 1944, a raid on Augsburg. His bomber, now equipped with inverted mounts on both waist positions, encountered two full-off 190 seconds, configured for dive bombing, attempting to attack the formation from high altitude. Kowalski's after-action report describes the engagement with notable satisfaction. Both bandits rolled in from about 16,000, pulled through to maybe 75-degree dives. Last year, we'd have been dead. This time, I tracked the first one all the way down, fired maybe 80 rounds, saw strikes on his port wing route. He pulled out trailing smoke and didn't come back for another pass. Second bandit saw his buddy get hit and broke off his attack early, jettisoned his bomb load about 8,000 feet too high. Didn't hit anything but French countryside. The combat effectiveness data, compiled by the 8th Air Force Operational Research Section in spring 1944, quantified what crews like Kowalski's experienced qualitatively. Bomber formations equipped with inverted gun installations suffered 37% fewer losses from dive bombing attacks compared to formations with only conventional mounts. This represented hundreds of aircraft and thousands of crew members who survived missions they statistically shouldn't have. The modification's influence extended beyond its immediate tactical application. The inverted mount represented a broader shift in American military culture toward field innovation and rapid adaptation. The traditional military procurement model said weapons systems were designed by engineers, tested by evaluators, approved by bureaucrats, and then issued to troops. This process typically took years. The inverted 50 caliber mount went from concept to widespread combat deployment in 4 months, entirely outside official channels, driven by maintenance personnel who saw a problem and fixed it without waiting for permission. The fact that the Army Air Forces eventually embraced and standardized the modification rather than suppressing it represented institutional recognition that winning wars required tolerating and even encouraging unofficial innovation. Lieutenant General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force from January 1943 through December 1943, later wrote about the inverted mount in his memoirs. Some of our most effective innovations came not from Wright Field or the Pentagon, but from crew chiefs and armourers at forward airfields, who refused to accept that their gunners should die because official doctrine said certain modifications were impossible. The inverted gun mount proved that sergeant ingenuity beats colonel bureaucracy when survival is at stake. This cultural shift had implications beyond gunnery. It encouraged other field modifications that improved combat effectiveness. Armour plate additions, improved oxygen systems, bomb bay fuel tanks for extended range missions. The lesson was clear. The people closest to the problem often understood it better than institutional experts, and giving them latitude to experiment produced results that top-down design processes couldn't match. The post-war analysis of the inverted mount's effectiveness concluded it had contributed to saving an estimated 200 to 300 heavy bombers that would otherwise have been lost to dive bombing attacks between August 1943 and May 1945. Each bomber carried 10 men. That translated to 2,000 to 3,000 lives, saved by a modification that started with a crew chief in North Africa, who was tired of watching his gunners die helpless. Sergeant Thomas Delaney, the crew chief who'd fabricated the first inverted mount, completed his tour and returned to the United States in December 1943. He received no medals, no official recognition for his innovation. His name appears in no official histories of American aerial gunnery development. But in the maintenance logs and crew diaries of the 98th Bomb Group, his name appears repeatedly, always in the context of the modification that finally gave American gunners the ability to fight back against an attack profile that had been killing them with impunity. The technical principle underlying the inverted mount's success, coverage of previously undefended geometric space, became a cornerstone of post-war defensive systems design. Modern aircraft defensive armament, from the tail guns on B-52 bombers in the 1,950 seconds through the sophisticated countermeasure systems on current military aircraft, all incorporate the lesson that threats can approach from any vector in three-dimensional space, and defensive systems must provide comprehensive coverage. The psychological lesson that humans can adapt to operate weapons in counterintuitive orientations when survival demands it proved equally important. Modern military training incorporates extensive practice with weapons in unconventional positions and orientations, specifically to build the neural pathways that allow soldiers to fight effectively even when traditional techniques don't apply. The inverted 50 caliber mount solves a problem that no longer exists. Modern air combat doesn't involve formations of bombers defending themselves against diving attackers with manually aimed machine guns. Surface-to-air missiles, radar-guided anti-aircraft systems, and fighter escorts with beyond-visual range weapons have made the tactical scenario obsolete. But the principle endures. When the geometry of a threat environment changes, defensive systems must adapt or die. The gunners and crew chiefs who flipped their guns upside down in summer 1943 understood this intuitively. They looked at the threat profile, analyzed what conventional doctrine couldn't address, and improvised a solution using the tools available. Staff Sergeant Leonard Vickers, the first gunner to score a confirmed kill with an inverted mount, survived the war and returned to his pre-war occupation as a high school mathematics teacher in Ohio. In 1967, he was interviewed by a local historian documenting veterans' experiences. Asked about the most important thing he'd learned during the war, Vickers' answer was characteristically direct. The military teaches you to follow procedures, respect the manual, trust the equipment you're issued. All of that is important. But sometimes the procedures are wrong, the manual is outdated, and the equipment isn't designed for the problem you're actually facing. When that happens, You have two choices: follow doctrine and die, or improvise and maybe survive. The inverted gun mount taught me that sometimes the right answer is to do everything backward. The final irony is that the modification that saved thousands of lives was motivated not by strategic vision or engineering, brilliance, but by frustration. Crew chiefs watching their friends get killed by threats they could see but couldn't shoot at. Gunners burning through ammunition at targets outside their geometric reach. The solution emerged from anger and necessity, refined through trial and error, spread through informal networks, and ultimately validated by the most reliable metric available: fewer men dying. By war's end, inverted 50 caliber mounts had become standard equipment on American heavy bombers. The modification that started as unauthorized field improvisation was now in technical manuals, taught at gunnery schools, and incorporated into new aircraft production. The evolution from bootleg innovation to official doctrine took less than 18 months, remarkable speed for military institutions normally resistant to change. The men who flew combat missions with inverted mounts rarely spoke about them in dramatic terms. To them, it was just another piece of equipment, another tool in the arsenal. But the statistics told a different story. Thousands of young men came home from the war because maintenance sergeants in North Africa decided conventional doctrine was killing people and did something about it. The legacy of the inverted 50 caliber mount lives in every modern defensive system designed around comprehensive threat coverage, in every training program that teaches unconventional weapons employment, in every institutional culture that tolerates field innovation rather than suppressing it. The specific hardware is obsolete, museum pieces now, but the principle that defensive systems must match threat geometry and that the people facing threats understand them better than distant planners remains as valid today as it was over Sicily in 1943. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.